All right, good evening. I am so glad that you all are here. Whoever is here, we are live on Facebook, we are live on Zoom, we are live on YouTube. I am letting people into the Zoom meeting. We've got things going all over the place. Tonight, on tonight's Vintage Vegan with me, your plant-based priest, the Reverend Susanna Cates, we are going to be making an old favorite of mine, porcupine meatballs, only in this case, it's going to be porcupine not meatballs, as you may have guessed, seeing as I am the plant-based priest. So porcupine meatballs, we're going to have some wonderful sweet and savory stewed tomatoes, some great onion biscuits, and some no-bake fudge cookies. So very exciting meal. I cannot wait to eat it. I can't wait to share all of this with all of you. And we're going to get started right away with our porcupine meatballs. This is something that I grew up with, of course, made with ground beef, but tonight we're using Beyond Meat. And I took, here's the cool thing about cooking plant-based. I never feel like my kitchen is under siege from bacteria and foodborne illness, because while some vegetables do have that risk, most of your foodborne illnesses are going to come from raw meat. But tonight, I've never cooked with this Beyond Meat ground beef stuff before. So I'm super excited to try it. And I tasted just a little tiny bit. It actually tastes like ground beef. It actually tastes like ground beef that's been on the grill for just a little bit. So I'm not sure how that's going to translate to the meatballs, but we'll find out. So there's a pound of that in here. I'm also going to add a half cup of rice. You can use any kind of long grain white rice with this. This is not converted rice. This is parboiled rice. Minute rice is, you can use minute rice and cook it for a lot less time. This is parboiled rice. It's going to take about 20 minutes. If you use regular long grain white rice, it'll take closer to 35 or 40 minutes. But all of them will work. You can find all kinds of different recipes for porcupine meatballs. I thought it was something my mother made up. We'll talk about that later. But I had no idea that it was a common dish until I was much, much older. So we have a pound of that ground Beyond Meat, a half cup of this parboiled rice, but any long grain rice will work. In the original recipe, you add an egg. Obviously, we're not going to do that tonight, but this is going to be our first time out of the gate with this egg replacer. This is Bob's Red Mill egg replacer. I've never used it before. It is not like flaxseed. Ground flaxseed is fine as an egg replacer, but this is a little bit smoother. When you have ground flaxseed, you can tell that it is a seed, right? It's got all those little bits of particulate and plant matter and seed matter in there. This is much finer. So it's 1 tablespoon of egg replacer and 2 tablespoons of water. Okay. And I'm going to blend that well with a fork. So the difference between this egg replacer and flaxseed is that this has tapioca starch. Tapioca starch is a thickener. It's a little bit like cornstarch or arrowroot. So that's going to be part of what helps it hold together better. Gosh, I don't even have my glasses on. A little bit of tapioca flour, potato starch kind of performs the same function as a binder. It has some baking soda. So if you're using this for baked goods, it doesn't have enough to change the measurements of baking soda, but one of the functions of baking soda is as a leavening agent, which makes things fluff up. That is also one of the functions of eggs. We talked about that a little bit last week. So when you have beaten eggs, they tend to hold the air so that when you put that into a mix, like a cake mix or a cupcake or cookie mix, it helps things stay fluffy. Egg performs the same function. So the baking soda in the egg replacer should not replace baking soda in a regular recipe. It's there, though, to provide the same kind of lift in a baked good that egg would do. We don't really need a lot of lift, per se, for meatballs, but it's in there in case you want to use this egg replacer for cakes, cookies, breads, sweetbreads, that kind of thing. While we're waiting for that egg to set, you need to let it sit there for about a minute with the water. We're going to go ahead and add our half teaspoon of plain black pepper. This is not a heavily seasoned dish, just so you know. This is a Depression era dish when ground beef, you wanted to make it go as long as you possibly could. If you were feeding a whole lot of people, A pound of ground beef is not going to take you very far. However, a pound of ground beef mixed with rice, this is half teaspoon of garlic salt and a half teaspoon of pepper that I added, by the way. If you mix it with rice, if you mix it with breadcrumbs the way you would for meatloaf, if you mix it with shredded potato, I've seen a lot of recipes for that, Depression era recipes with shredded potato and ground beef, which also extends it. And they say the side benefit is your hamburgers and Salisbury steaks have never been so juicy because you've added potato. Also, you've extended what would feed about 4 people to what would feed 6 to 8 people. So it's a good deal. And then a half teaspoon, actually a tablespoon, not a teaspoon, of minced onion. You can also use a 1/4 cup of fresh onion, but we are doing this vintage style, which means the more processed your food, the better. Now, to be honest, if you're going to go for processed food, minced onion and spices are probably the least harm you're going to be able to do. I wouldn't worry so much about using minced over fresh. Also, the thing is, and this is about half teaspoon of salt. The thing is, oh, good, our egg. Okay. The thing is, what we're doing here, this is not a racy dish. This is comfort food. And this is from a time and an era where foreign food in the United States, I wouldn't say it was suspect, but it was largely unknown. And so you didn't have people that wanted to add big, bold flavors because that wasn't a thing yet. Big, bold flavors started entering the American cooking lexicon probably sometime in the late 50s, early 60s. But until then, any kind of ethnic food you were going to cook was very mild, like a hint of curry powder in your curried chicken, a little touch of ginger in your Polynesian or Asian cooking, not anything strongly flavored. And this right here, this is a meatball, guys. This is what this is. It's a meatball with rice. And we're not going to get crazy with the seasonings unless you want to. And there are times and places, but we're kind of keeping it authentic to 50s and 60s style tonight. So here is our egg replacer. I know that looks terribly appetizing, but it does look thick, which I find kind of inspiring because I want this thing to stick together. So all of the ingredients are now in here, and I'm going to use my hand just to mix it all up into a homogeneous mixture mass here. So the egg, the salt, the pepper, the garlic salt, the minced onion, the Beyond beef, and the rice. I'm just squishing it all with my hands, not too much because we want it to stay fluffy, so that it is all formed up together. I'm going to turn my stove on. Okay. And I'm going to turn it to medium heat. I'm going to bring the mixture over here. And here is where we brown the meatballs first. And then we're going to let them simmer once they're browned. So I'm going to add a little bit of olive oil to the bottom of the pan, just enough to cover. And again, this is on medium heat, but since we're browning this, I'm going to go ahead and turn it to medium high because we're not going to keep it there for very long. I'm going to rinse some of this off my hands. And it is fatty, so that Beyond Meat does have some fat in it. I've had it in restaurants like in Beyond Burgers and things like that, but I've not yet cooked with it. So this is going to be maybe new for you, definitely new for me. I've left my hands wet. Why? Because when you're forming meatballs or dumplings or anything that's really sticky like this, if your hands are wet, it won't stick. So I'm forming little meatballs with the rice and all the seasonings in it, about the size of a golf ball. I'm popping it right into that oil. So I'm just going to keep doing that. It holds together very well, so that's a plus. I was a little concerned using plant-based meat and an egg substitute if it would hold together, but it is. It's actually a very firm mixture, so no worries there. And it actually holds its shape a little bit better than a meatball would do. And I'm not putting these in the pan in any particular style or order, just wherever it goes, that's where it goes, because they're all going to cook together. So it's starting to get hot. I can hear it sizzle. That's a good sign. And I'm going to keep coming back here just to keep my hands a little bit wet, because that's going to keep everything from sticking when I get it in the pan. So keep adding meatball by meatball. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This one is number 6. Here is number 7. Okay. So assuming that every person in your house can eat 4 meatballs, perhaps at one sitting, that's 2 people. But keep in mind, this is only 1 pound of protein. I will say that the meat substitutes tend to be at least as expensive and sometimes a little more expensive than ground beef, but it also goes on sale. So if you're hesitant about it because of the cost, wait until it goes on sale and then buy a bunch of it, because it lives in your freezer. Unlike ground beef, you keep it in the freezer until it's ready. Oh, you can freeze ground beef too, of course, but this is made to stick around in your freezer for a little while, and then you take it out, defrost it, and then I brought this up to room temperature, took it out of the fridge. It was already thawed, but I took it out of the fridge and brought it to room temperature about an hour before this class started, because when you have meat at room temperature, it cooks a lot more evenly. So keep that in mind too. So these meatballs are all coming together, just a few more here. I'm really pleased with the way they're holding together. I don't know if it's the composition of the Beyond Meat or if it's the egg replacer, but it is really keeping itself together, and they're holding together in the pan as well. So one more little one. Okay, this is a little tiny baby one. This one's going to cook super fast. Okay. All right, now I can actually wash off my hands. And again, this is not animal fat that I'm rinsing off. Whatever fat is in here is plant-based, and it rinses off a lot more quickly. And I don't have to worry about E. coli and salmonella and a bunch of other stuff that might have infiltrated my raw meat. So what I'm going to do is, as these are browning, I'm just going to flip them over. Oh, it looks wonderful. It looks and smells just like meat, you guys. Jiggle it around and loosen up some of the ones that are already cooking, and just kind of turn them over and turn them around so that they get browned on all their sides. This is making me as hungry as any meat dish ever has. This is wonderful. I am so excited about this. So you just want to flip them over and make sure that they're getting nice color on the top and the bottom. If they stick a little bit, just kind of get up underneath them with this tongue and flip them over anyway. They're, like I said, they're holding together absolutely beautifully. I don't think I've seen very many actual meatballs that have held together as well as these are. So I'm very pleased. That was my biggest concern, that I was going to try and make these and that they were just going to completely disintegrate and we would have like Beyond hash or something. So I'm really glad that that is not the case. In fact, I can show you with one of these. Don't want to drop it. So you see, they're holding their shape really, really well, even without being cooked through, which is wonderful. And you're also dealing with a lot less fat content because you don't have the egg, you don't have ground beef. What you have is this plant-based substitute, very high in protein, just the same, but without a lot of the stuff that you are trying to, I think, avoid. So these have been flipped. They're browning nicely. The next step is I'm going to take some vegetable stock. You can use water also. You can just use plain water. That's what my mother always used. I'm going to pour that in the bottom. So they reach about a quarter of the way up on those meatballs, not meatballs. Put the lid on. Make sure that it comes up to a simmer. I'm going to keep an eye on that, but I'm also going to set the timer for 20 minutes. And in 20 minutes, we'll check and see whether the rice is done. At this point in time, especially if you're using plant-based meat, it's not going to take very long for the plant-based meat to cook to a point where it's safe and palatable. What we're waiting on is the rice, and that's why I use the parboiled rice instead of regular rice. But we're going to let that sit there, and I'll take a little peek. Okay, it's simmering really well. I'm going to turn the heat down just a little bit so that it doesn't boil. We just want it to stay at a nice simmer, and we'll keep an eye on the liquid as well to make sure that it doesn't all boil away. While that's doing its thing, we're actually going to start on our non-bake, no-bake fudge cookies, because they have to chill for a little bit before we can scoop them out and let them chill one final time, and then they magically become cookies. So it is no-bake, but they're not no-cook. So I'm going to turn my little saucepan here to about medium. We have a 1/4 cup of plant-based butter here. So all the squishy ingredients go in the pot, and you can actually make this. I don't need this because I have the pot. This is a one-pot recipe, and the more of those I have in my life, the happier I am. So we're going to get that butter melting in there. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a 1/2 cup of peanut butter. Before we measure out the peanut butter and the syrup, for that matter, I'm going to spray this 1/2 cup measure with nonstick cooking spray. It's really a negligible amount of fat or oil, but what it does do is allow the peanut butter to slide right out of the measuring cup. And that's what we want, because peanut butter can be a real bear to work with, much as I love it. So we're going to get a 1/2 cup of peanut butter in here. And this is crunchy peanut butter, because there's no point having creamy peanut butter as far as I am concerned. I think it's goopy enough to where we can just scrape it in there. So as I said, all of the goopy ingredients go into the heated saucepan. And I'll tell you what to do with the non-goopy ingredients in just a second. But we have to get these warmed up first. Okay, almost there. Almost there. I really need a camera person in this kitchen so you can see exactly what I'm doing. Although measuring peanut butter is not the most exciting thing I could be doing. Still, you might want to get a closer look. Okay. All right, so here's our 1/2 cup of peanut butter. We're going to add that in. And see, because I oiled it, most of it just comes right out with a little bit of coaxing. Okay. So there's that. Let me wash this. Please hold. Get the peanut butter off my hands. So the butter, 1/4 cup of butter, 1/2 cup of peanut butter, 1/2 cup of maple syrup. You can also use honey. But I find maple syrup a little bit easier to work with most of the time. Okay. Every last little bit of everything. We're simmering away nicely here. It's got a glass top, so I can keep an eye on my meatballs, which is nice. So there's all of that. And then about a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla. So in here, again, butter, peanut butter, maple syrup, a little bit of vanilla. We're going to help it along by stirring it. There we go. Beautifully melted. Getting there. We're getting there. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat off and take the heat off now. The butter is almost, but not completely melted, but we don't want this mixture to cook. We just wanted everything to melt and combine together before we start adding the dry ingredients. So I'm going to add about ½ teaspoon of salt. Okay. A ¼ cup of unsweetened baking cocoa. This is a wonderful thing to have in the house. You can get all kinds of creative if you have dry, unsweetened baking cocoa in your house. So ¼ cup of that. Mix carefully because cocoa has a tendency, even if you're just using a little bit, to poof, go everywhere. So mix the cocoa. I mean, chocolate and peanut butter. How could this possibly go wrong? I will tell you, when I was researching, there are lots and lots and lots of recipes for no-bake fudge cookies. However, most of them call for 2 cups of sugar. That is a lot, like a lot of sugar. So these only called for ½ cup of honey or maple syrup or agave, which since they're already in a liquid form, tend to have a little bit sweeter of a flavor than dry sugar. And I thought, you know, a ½ cup of honey or maple syrup as opposed to 2 entire cups of white sugar, that's a no-brainer. White sugar is delicious. It's, I mean, I grew up eating it in all baked goods that I had. But if you can find an alternative to cut down on your sugar intake, it's going to help your health immensely. 2 cups of quick cooking oats. And here is where we really want to make sure everything is incorporated, because this is the recipe, y'all. This is all there is to it. So we started with a ¼ cup of plant-based butter. We added to it a ½ cup of peanut butter. We added to that a ½ cup of maple syrup, a pinch of salt, about a ½ teaspoon of vanilla. And then we put in our ¼ cup of cocoa and 2 cups of these quick cooking oats. And that, for the cookies, for this stage of the cookies, is it. So now that we have this mixture together, and it's a very hefty mixture at that, we're going to put it in the fridge because we can't really do much more with it until it cools off. So I'm going to put that in here and let it think about what it's done for a couple of minutes. And then we're going to move on and start our tomatoes. So stewed tomatoes, a common side dish with these porcupine meatballs that my mother would make. In fact, I don't remember her ever making these with anything other than stewed tomatoes, and she usually served it with some broccoli that had been cooked beyond what was good for it and what was good for us as well. She was a product of her environment. Vegetables were meant to be cooked until you could basically puree them at the side of a spoon. And that's what we got until probably about the mid-'80s, when she and my dad took a cooking class and were kind of brought to the realization that you don't have to cook vegetables that way. You can steam them, or you can boil them lightly, or you can stir fry them. They never got into roasting. They never made it that far. But after that, the quality of our vegetable side dishes changed drastically, and may I say, for the better. But growing up as a child, it was porcupine meatballs, plain stewed tomatoes, broccoli, squish, and then whatever she had chosen for salad and dessert. But stewed tomatoes always. These are a kind of riff on that. They're a little bit more flavorful, I think I would say, than just plain stewed tomatoes out of a can. But they're very good. So we have a cast iron skillet. Cast iron skillets plus tomatoes equals extra iron intake for you. So if you're not using a cast iron skillet, consider it, especially if you cook a lot of acidic foods with vinegar, tomatoes, things like that, because it will actually leach a little bit of the iron out of the cast iron and pass the benefits on to you, which is something that you actually do want, just in case you didn't know that. Let's see. We're looking good on the meatballs. I'm going to turn the heat down a little bit because it's really kind of frothing in there rather than simmering. And I'm going to add just, ooh, yes, just a touch more of that broth. Looking good, looking good. Okay. So in our oil that's heating up there in our cast iron skillet, and it wasn't much, just enough to cover kind of the bottom of the pan, we're going to put 2 tablespoons of brown sugar. Tomatoes and sweet go very, very well together. In fact, when you make tomato sauce, it's kind of a good idea to add just a pinch of either sugar or orange juice because that tones down the harshness of the acidity just a little tiny bit and brings out some of the other flavors. So remember that. Add a little tiny bit of sugar when you're cooking tomatoes because it enhances the flavor and tones down any kind of harshness that's there. So the oil, the brown sugar, and we're also going to add some fennel seed, which gives it a unique sort of savory, sausagey, but also sweet-ish sort of flavor. You can grind these if you like. I'm not going to add a whole tablespoon. I'm going to add about half a tablespoon to that because that seems like a lot of fennel for 1 little can of tomatoes. Okay. And what we want to do, we want to heat up the brown sugar and the fennel seed. Not until it burns, and we do not want the sugar to caramelize. We don't want it to get burned or stick to the pan. We're just trying to melt it and bring out some of the aromatics in the fennel. Fennel is very strongly fragranced and very strongly flavored. That's one of the things I love about it. But you don't want it to burn, and you don't want this to turn into candy plus tomatoes because that would just be weird, right? Open the can of tomatoes while we're at it. And do the recycling bin, Judo. Okay, so it's starting to come out a little bit. Nice molassesy note from the brown sugar. That good spice note coming from the fennel. I'm going to turn the heat up just a little tiny bit. Like I said, it's very careful. You want to be real careful not to start making the brown sugar turn to caramel. You want it to be nice and sweet and have a nice rich flavor, but you don't want it to turn into burnt candy because that's not good with anything, much less tomatoes. So olive oil, brown sugar, fennel. Okay, now the fennel is really starting to come through, which is good. Okay. I'm going to start adding the tomatoes. This is canned whole tomatoes. And what I'm going to do, you can't really see what I'm doing here on one of these screens. I'm holding it in my hand, in my fingers, and with my fingers, I'm squishing it into this pan. So I know on one of these cameras, you can't quite see what I'm doing, but again, it's in my fingers, and I'm just bringing my fingers together and crushing it into the pan. So rather than using a knife to try and dice these up or putting them in entirely whole, I'm just, you see, I always get at least one tomato that wants to herald its arrival for the big spray of tomato juice. Now I'm going to have to clean them off. Oh, well. Now it's really, you can hear it start to sizzle from the tomato juice that's in there. I'm just reaching in here one by one, getting my tomato, using my fingers to just crush it into that brown sugar and fennel mix. And it doesn't have to be completely destroyed. You can leave it kind of attached to the stem end. Most of these whole tomatoes, they want to stick together. That's fine. Let it do that if that's what it wants to do. Okay, I think that was the last whole tomato that's in the can. Crushed, squashed in there. So all the tomato juice goes in there with it. Okay. So stir that around with the fennel and the brown sugar that's already in there. We're going to go ahead and turn up the heat. Oh, that smells divine. If tomato could be a savory dessert, that's what it would smell like. So we have ground allspice. We're going to use a half teaspoon of that. And ground cloves. We're going to use a half teaspoon of that. And one of my very favorite ingredients for almost anything that is savory, this is chili garlic sauce. I put it on almost everything that I make. I put it into stir-fry sauce. I put it into soup. I put it into plain, you know, sauteed vegetables and rice. And today, a whole tablespoon is going into our tomato mixture. Spicy food is good for you, just in case you didn't know. It helps keep your sinuses clear, if that's ever an issue for you. It does, to some degree, act as an endorphin producer, so sort of a painkiller, sort of a mood improver. It's just good for you. Look it up. I can't expound on all of its benefits right this second, but I promise you it is good stuff. So if you can deal with spicy food, please do spice your food up whenever you think it's appropriate. So this is pretty liquidy right now. I'm going to make it just a touch liquidy more by adding some balsamic vinegar. I'm going to crank the heat up because I really do want this to simmer and kind of cook out some of the excess liquid. The balsamic vinegar is going to function as another kind of acid along with the acid that the tomatoes have and give it a real depth of flavor. So just a splash of balsamic vinegar. We have the fennel seeds, the brown sugar, the allspice, the ground cloves, the chili garlic sauce. And now it's starting to cook really nicely. We're going to let it cook without a lid because we want that liquid to cook out of it. It's going to give it a very rich, rich flavor. And again, a lot of depth from the different herbs and spices and acidity that's in there. So I'm going to turn it back down to just slightly above medium heat. And I'll check back on it from time to time. Now my oven is heated to 450 degrees. I have here a square baking pan, and it's filled with melted butter. To this melted butter, I'm going to add a teaspoon, so 2 of these, a teaspoon of dried dill. Okay. Another teaspoon of parsley, dried parsley. Boom. And another teaspoon of these very same dried onion flakes. Now, stir that around a little bit. I have to say, this next step, after I stir all this around, this is melted plant-based butter and all of these spices. This is for our onion biscuits. And it was kind of a thrill and also kind of terrifying to learn that a lot of these refrigerated biscuits are what I call accidentally vegan. They didn't do it on purpose to cater to the vegan community. It just so happens that when they say butter flavored, they really do mean butter flavored, and there's no actual butter in here. These are not processed, however, in environments that are free from animal products. So if that is super, super important to you, don't do it. However, if this is not as big a deal for you, refrigerated biscuits, as it turns out, don't have any animal products in them at all, although they may have trace amounts just because of the processing. That being said, I was sort of happy when I found out that they are, because they're fun to cook with from time to time. I don't eat these on a regular basis, but they're kind of like that, ooh, I'm being naughty kind of thing. However, opening these womp biscuits, as I call them, is so terrifying to me. And I'm really burying my soul here in doing this with all of you. So I'm going to open it a little bit. And it says to press a spoon. You can see I am extremely gingerly about this whole thing. It says to press a spoon against the seam. I am not doing that. I'm not having that close to me. The reason why they're called womp biscuits is because you find the seam, you find a handicap, and if you stand there and talk long enough, after you take the wrapper off, it will just come open. You're welcome. I hope that made all of you happy. It didn't make me very happy, but it works. So we have our biscuits open now. let me check on our meatballs real quick. Okay, our tomatoes are this beautiful dark red color. They're simmering nicely. The liquid is cooking out. I'm going to, oh yes, these porcupine meatballs look like, just like Mom used to make. They smell good too. I'm going to turn them over so that these top sides have a chance to do their thing. But it looks like the rice is almost there. So I think we, in fact, are almost there with these meatballs. Oh, they look wonderful. All right, so I'm going to put the top back on. I'm going to set our timer for another 10 minutes, and that should just about do it. So anyway, here are our biscuits. I'm going to break each one into 3 pieces, roll them into a ball, and roll them around in that herbed onion butter, and just keep going with that. So all these little balls, is really more like a pull-apart bread than an actual biscuit. Just keep them in there, stuck close together. And I'm just kind of dredging them through the butter and the herbs that are in here, the plant-based butter and herbs that are in here, and tucking them in so that they stick together. Very quick process. And as much as I love to cook, I cannot make biscuits. I have tried, Lord knows I have tried. Before I was plant-based, I even used lard, I have used buttermilk, I have used every recipe that I've ever been able to find that says, you cannot possibly mess this up. And guess what? I have messed it up. So, you know, I'm not a quitter, but I will also say that sometimes letting the Pillsbury Doughboy do his good work has worked out well for me. And this is one of those experiences, especially now when here's the thing, if making baked goods was not your forte before you became plant-based, it is an extra challenge once you do. And I am not about turning down challenge. I would not be doing what I do in any sector of the imagination if I was worried about challenge. That being said, there comes a time where you have to be very honest about your own skills and your own liabilities. And for me, that is with some baked goods. Now, it turns out I'm a little bit better at bread than I thought I was. But that's generally not plant-based anyway, that's yeast. But with very delicate, creamy sorts of baked goods, I just never really excelled at that. It is even more difficult when you enter the world of plant-based cooking because you have to come up with all kinds of substitutes. So if you want to do that, and if you really enjoy the challenge of finding interesting recipes for cookies and cakes and cupcakes that don't, then by all means do it. And I will share some of them with you because I've had some successes. But if it's not your thing, please don't let that, bring you down or make you forget about plant-based cooking altogether. There are people who do it better than you do, and you can buy their stuff. So do that. So here are our onion and herb biscuits, pull-apart bread biscuity things. You know what? There's one or two left in here. I'm going to throw those in there too. They're not going to have quite as much juice on them as these ones, but haste or waste not, want not, I always say. So we're just going to tuck those in, and they'll probably soak up some of the other flavor from the other biscuits that are in there. 450 degrees, 8 to 10 minutes. So probably at about the time that these porcupine meatballs are done, this is turning into like a very rich tomato jam. You'll notice that when we were adding all of these flavors and seasonings to the tomato, what we didn't do was add salt. The reason that I did not add salt to it right out of the gate is because tomatoes are very high in sodium. And so I don't want to add any salt to it until I taste it first and make sure that it actually needs it. It might not. And the more it cooks down, the more concentrated all of the seasonings are going to be, including whatever natural salts are in there, and I don't want to mess with that. But in the meantime, this is absolutely beautiful. It smells heavenly. This would be a wonderful Christmas dish. It smells very Christmassy because of the clove and the allspice. I'm going to taste a little bit of that tomato cooking liquid. Oh my. And the spice from the chili garlic is on point. So it needs salt, I think, but I want it to cook down just a little bit more. So I'm going to let it do that. And I think it needs just a little bit more of that bright acidity from the balsamic vinegar. That I can go ahead and add. The salt, I'm going to wait, because who knows? So we've got a few more minutes on the porcupines, a few more minutes for the, what's in the oven? The biscuits. So what we can do in the meantime is see how our no-bake fudge cookies have come out of the fridge. Give me just a second here. Here we are. So I'm going to get another spoon. So it's, oh yeah, that's chilled up very nicely. So what I'm going to do, everything tonight is about shaping your mixture. Just a little ball with a teaspoon and then flatten it out and put it on a foil lined tray. So a little ball with a spoon, flatten it out with your hands, set it on the tray. Since these aren't going to be baked and since they're not going to spread out at all, you can put them really close together because they're going to stay the same size. So ball in your spoon, flatten it out a little bit, put it right there. So since we didn't use a recipe that has 2 whole cups of sugar, these are actually not bad for you. There's lots of good fiber, insoluble or soluble fiber, I mean, from the oats, which is a good thing. I'm going to do the same thing. These are starting to fall apart because it's starting to stick to my hand. So I'm going to wash that off. And I'm going to shake my hands off, but I'm actually going to dry them because the same trick that works when we made those meatballs will work with these. If my hands are a little bit damp, I can form them a lot easier and they don't stick. So anytime that you have to use your hands for a sticky mixture, try dampening your hands first, and that will probably help you a lot. And for those of you that were paying close attention and taking notes, yes, I did lick some off of my fingers before I washed my hands, and yes, it is absolutely delicious. Because like I said, chocolate, peanut butter, I'm not really sure where you're going to find a problem with that. I'm not ever going to find a problem with that. If you are peanut intolerant, then of course, there's a big problem with that. Not one that I want you to deal with. So sunflower butter or any other kind of allergen-friendly butter will work with this. So feel free to experiment if that's something that is a concern for you. Okay. Just flattening them out. But, you know, going with the ½ cup of maple syrup instead of 2 whole cups of sugar, these are still quite sweet, but not sickly sweet. I can't imagine what 2 cups of sugar would taste like in a cookie like this. It would be completely sickly and overwhelming. I'm really glad that I was able to find a recipe that was not as sugar heavy as the original one. Yeah, these are holding really, really beautifully well. And they came together quite quickly too. You can see what time is it? It's 6:44 p.m. We started at 6 o'clock, and our whole meal, including dessert, is almost ready to go. Just a couple more minutes for the porcupine meatballs. And while I'm thinking of it, let me give this a little stir. Oh yeah. So this is turning into almost like a spicy tomato jam. And if you don't like the flavors of clove or allspice or anything else that we've used in that, the tomatoes taste really good. Just heat it up with some balsamic vinegar and served straight up. That's how, I mean, we didn't even have, balsamic vinegar was not a thing when I was growing up. We just had stewed tomatoes right out of the can, heated up on the stove, back in my day, right? But they were wonderful, and they were a good complement to the meatballs, and they still are. I just like to fancy them up just a little tiny bit for more modern and sophisticated taste, which I know all of you certainly have. So almost done with these oatmeal cookies. Okay. I think we might be able to get one more out of here after this one. So we've got about 20 cookies here, and you can make them smaller, and you don't have to flatten them out. You could just make them little oatmeal balls if you want. I think they'll probably cool a little bit faster with more surface area. So we have 21 of these little no-bake fudge round cookies. Relatively healthy for you, certainly not as bad for you as a lot of other cookies could be. They're in the fridge now, so they can firm up a little. Right in time for our meatballs, right in time for our tomatoes. Let me check that seasoning one more time before I decide what to do with it. Because I may want to add some salt. I may not, but I may. This is beautiful, rich burgundy color on these tomatoes. So let me taste the sauce. Need salt. But golly, all of those flavors working together are spectacular. I am really happy about these tomatoes, and that's not something you get to say very often. Oh, the fennel. I just got a little pop of that fennel. It's amazing. Wow. Yum. All right. Okay. So, meatballs, tomato. Biscuits are getting there. Let me at least start to plate the meatballs, and we'll take a little snack of those and see how they turn out. Okay. It looks as though the rice is done. So I'm going to get a couple of these meatballs here. And of course, if you like green vegetables, this would be a perfect dish to have your green vegetables with, because you've got your meat, your protein anyway, not meat. You've got your protein and your starch all together in these porcupine meatballs. We're going to add to the top. Wait till you see this. This is so beautiful. To the top, and it was so tasty. I want to make sure I have a little bit on the side to enjoy. So we have these stewed tomatoes. It's really more like a tomato jam at this point, with all the spices and the balsamic vinegar and our little porcupine not meatballs. So let me take a little piece and make sure that our meatballs are cooked all the way through. The meat part certainly will be. The rice is what I want to check. So we've got some of the porcupine on here. We've got some of the rice in there. It's just like Mom used to make, only better. I am so excited about this. I can have porcupine meatballs again, and so can you. This is so cool. So it was one of those meals. My mom had a rotation of, I don't know, 8 to 10, probably more than that. Had a rotation of meals that would kind of go throughout the days. And if I came home and smelled porcupine meatballs, I was so happy, and I could not wait for dinner. I loved these. They were the perfect comfort food for me. I love highly spiced food now. I love adventurous food now. This is the opposite. Even with the Beyond Meat, the seasonings, the spices, the flavor is almost exactly the same as that very gently flavored, warming, comforting food that my mother would serve several times, maybe once every month and a half, once every 2 months. But I loved it every time. It never got old, and I have missed it. And it's not something that I have ever really made on a regular basis, because I am careful about my intake of the processed plant-based stuff. It's wonderful. It provides you a lot of versatility. You can sub it pretty much one for one in all of your recipes. But if I really want something home style, old school comfort food, this is where I'm going from now on. I promise you, if you feed this to somebody, they will not ever know that this is plant-based. I'm absolutely delighted about this. The stewed tomatoes, I'll go ahead and say it. It's a step up from the can of tomatoes heated up in a pot and tossed on the plate. That's fantastic. I'm very happy about those. Let's take a look at the biscuits. Oh yeah, look at these. Look how pretty these are. So these have cooked. They've puffed up nicely. They're sizzling on the bottom because they're covered in that plant-based butter. I forgot that there's an option for those of you who like a little bit of extra flavor. I found this plant-based Parmesan cheese this past week, and it is lovely. It is Good Planet brand. And let's see what happens if I just sprinkle a little bit on top of my not meatballs and my stewed tomatoes. So now, guys, now we have party. Because we have our meatballs, we have our stewed tomatoes, and now, look, we have these fluffy, golden brown, delightfully seasoned little biscuits to go with. Oh my goodness, look at that, look at that. Okay, so I'm gonna eat this, and then I'm gonna eat my no-bake fudge cookies. But tonight, guys, I don't wanna brag, but I have showed you how to make a perfect dinner, like a perfect dinner. I cannot imagine anyone of any age looking at this, especially these wonderful, buttery, flavorful, soft, crunchy, herby little biscuits, and saying, no, I'd rather not. This is hands down one of the best things that I've had the opportunity to share with you. So recipes are online, www.plantbasedbriest.com. If you go to the recipe section, it's right at the top. It's called Porcupine Feast. You can show it to your friends and have them be astonished and dismayed that you're eating porcupine, and then you can let them in on the secret. Try this. Please try at least one of the elements from tonight's meal, and you will not be disappointed. We'll be back next week, same time, same place, 6 o'clock p.m. on Wednesday. I can't wait to share with you whatever's coming next. Remember, you were created by love, for love. Please go out and be love. Have a wonderful night, everybody. Bye-bye.